is cold in the way that institutions are cold. Not from the temperature of the air, but from the absence of warmth in the walls. A man sits in a chair near the window. His body is present. His eyes are open. He does not blink when a door closes somewhere down the corridor. The hands in his lap are perfectly still, arranged with no particular intention, simply resting as stones rest at the bottom of a riverbed. A physician stands a few feet away and watches him. The physician has a notebook. He has been watching men like this one for years. He still cannot say what is happening inside. That is the condition of psychiatry at the turn of the 20th century. The disorder has been given a name, dementia praecox. And the name has been written into the textbooks, and the textbooks have been placed on the shelves of every clinic in Europe. The name, however, explains nothing. It describes an outcome. The mechanism behind the locked face, behind the stillness and the strangeness, remains out of reach. Chish, in 1886, proposed that the essential thing was an incapacity for attention. It was a reasonable observation. A man who cannot direct his attention cannot order his thoughts. Freusberg went a step further. For Freusberg, the motor disturbances of the catatonic patient, the rigid posture, the strange and held gestures, were not primary. They were symptoms. They were the visible measure of something happening in the psyche. Consciousness had weakened. Its control over the mental processes had loosened. The body was showing, on its surface, the degree of an interior tension. Robert Summer brought an experiment into the ward in 1894. He showed patients pictures and timed their reactions. The ideational process was slowed. The patient could not tear himself away from what he had been shown. He was caught by it, fixated, held at it, long after an ordinary man would have moved on. Summer called the frequent blockings, the long silences between stimulus and response, a form of visual fixation. He compared the catatonic state to what happens to a healthy person in a moment of staring into empty space, of pure amazement. The parallel suggested that the laws governing the normal mind had not vanished inside the ward. They were operating. They were simply operating under conditions that distorted their usual expression. The question was what those conditions were. Kraepelin named the emotional deterioration at the core of the clinical picture. Aschaffenburg confirmed the disturbance of attention. Seen agreed. Then Stransky examined the precise relationship between feeling and thought, and found that in dementia praecox, the two had come apart. He named the intellect the Nupsyche and the emotional life the Thymopsyche, and proposed that in this disease, the coordination between them, the delicate, constant calibration that in a healthy person goes unnoticed, had failed. The result was affect and content that no longer corresponded. A patient laughed at nothing visible. A patient raged at what appeared to be nothing at all. But Stransky's explanation had a fault. man may rage for reasons that are real and invisible. An observer who sees only the rage and not the history behind it will call it disproportionate. In dementia praecox, the histories were almost never visible. The patients were, as clinicians put it, shut in. A new mechanism, Stransky's intrapsychic ataxia, named the phenomenon without accounting for it. It was a term for the strangeness, not an explanation of its source. Weigand, following Wundt, called the endpoint of the disease apperceptive deterioration. Wundt's concept of apperception was vast. It covered attention, feeling, the act by which any content is brought to clear comprehension. To say that apperception had deteriorated in dementia praecox was to say that almost everything essential to mental life had been damaged. The concept was so large that it contained all the symptoms without illuminating any of them. Massillon, trained in the French school, saw the disorder converging on a single root he could feel, but not quite name. He described it in clusters: apathy, loss of volition, the disappearance of desire, a veritable cramping of the cerebral activity. He found something important in passing, that certain memories intimately connected with the patient's emotional life tended to reproduce themselves without ceasing, to occupy consciousness continuously. He called this the coagulation of thought. The mind was not dissolving into chaos. It was freezing around something. He did not press the point. He moved on to other matters. Pelletier observed that the associations of dementia praecox patients followed the laws of similarity, coexistence, and sound, the same laws that govern the dreaming mind. She used Pierre Janet's phrase, abaissement du niveau mental, a lowering of the mental level. When the highest integrating function relaxes its hold, the more primitive mechanisms take over. The course of association descends from directed thought toward the logic of dreams. Gross attempted to describe what rose up when consciousness loosened its grip. He argued that chains of association continued beneath a level of awareness, separate and simultaneous, and that when the coherence of ego consciousness failed, these subterranean chains erupted into the field of the conscious mind as automatic phenomena. Sudden, strange ideas, hallucinations, impulses that arrived with the force of external commands. The patient experienced them as foreign because they were, in a meaningful sense, foreign. They came from a layer of mind that the ego did not govern. Freud had already answered in part what that layer contained. In 1893, he had shown how a hallucinatory delirium arises from an effect that consciousness cannot tolerate. In 1896, he had analyzed a paranoid case in the dementia praecox category and demonstrated that the content of the delusions and hallucinations was not random. It was determined. It was shaped by repressed complexes of ideas, by thoughts and feelings so charged with painful meaning that they had been expelled from consciousness and were now returning through the floor, transformed, disguised but traceable through careful analysis back to their source. The symptoms expressed content. The content was biographical, but Freud's analysis also exposed the limit of the psychological explanation. The mechanism he uncovered could account for the specific form of the delusions. He could not account for the fact that delusions appeared at all. In hysteria, the same mechanism produced mobile, shifting symptoms. In dementia praecox, it produced fixed ones. The affects did not move. They coagulated, as Massillon had said. Something other than psychology was at work. Or psychology was working alongside something else. A hypothetical conjecture was set down with care. The hysterogenic complex produces symptoms that are reparable. In dementia praecox, the affect might favor anomalies in the metabolism, toxins perhaps, that injured the brain in ways the psyche alone could not repair. The newest and last complex before the injury coagulates and determines the content of the symptoms forever after. The possibility was left open. The evidence was not yet sufficient to close it in any direction. Every framework assembled for the disorder thus pointed toward a disturbance at the center of the mind. A perception, attention, feeling, the threshold of consciousness. And every framework fell short. The symptoms had been catalogued with increasing precision across 2 decades. Their surface had been mapped. Schisch, Freusberg, Sommer, Kraepelin, Aschaffenburg, Stransky, Weygand, Massillon, Pelletier, Gross, Freud. Each had added a facet, a measurement, a structural hypothesis. None had arrived at the thing itself. The man by the window has not moved. His hands are still in his lap. The physician closes his notebook. What is happening inside that stillness has been described in a dozen different vocabularies, and all of them describe the surface. The disorder has been measured like a landscape from the air, its distances and contours recorded with care, its roads and rivers named. No one has yet stood on the ground inside it. The locked door between the observing eye and the interior life of the patient remains exactly where it was, present, solid, and awaiting a different kind of key. The scale narrows. The ward recedes. The corridor, the locked door, the physician with his notebook, all of it falls away. What remains is a single ordinary mind on an ordinary afternoon, and the question of what governs it. The essential basis of personality is not thought. It is affectivity. Thought and action are only its symptoms. This proposition is not intuitive. It runs against the way the mind prefers to describe itself, as a reasoning instrument, as something that deliberates and decides. The evidence, however, points elsewhere. The elements of psychic life arrive in functional units. Each unit contains 3 components fused together: sense perception, intellectual content, and feeling tone. A man meets an old friend on the street. In his mind, there forms immediately a complex image: the face, the memory, the history. These three components are not assembled in sequence. They arrive together as a single thing. The image of the friend carries with it the tone of every past encounter. Through the friend's thoughtless gossip, the man was once drawn into a very unpleasant affair. The consequences lasted for a long time. Now the friend's face is not a neutral object. It is one molecule in a larger mass, and that mass carries a definite feeling of irritation. Every element within it participates in that irritation. Each one carries the charge of the whole, with greater or lesser distinctness, depending on how clearly its connection to the larger situation can be seen. This is the feeling-toned complex. It is a higher psychic unity. A body made up of countless molecules, each one linked to the others by a common feeling. The ego complex is the strongest of all complexes. It is the whole mass of ideas belonging to the self, accompanied at all times by the powerful feeling tone of the body's own sensations. The ego is the psychological expression of every associated body sensation combined into one. A normal person's sense of self is anchored in the body. It is dense. It is stable. It weathers ordinary storms because it is more richly associated than almost anything else in the mind. But the ego is not the whole of the mind. It is only its strongest authority. On a country walk, a physician observes a companion. The companion is sensitive, hysterical in the clinical sense, and the two of them are walking through a village famous for its charming situation. The bells begin to peal a new and harmonious chime. The companion stops. He cannot bear it. He says the ringing is disgusting. In the major key, he says, it sounds frightful. The church is hideous. The village is squalid. None of this is true. The village is well known for its beauty. The chime is harmonious by any measure. The affect is entirely inappropriate to its object. The physician does not dismiss it. He follows the thread. The companion begins to abuse the local parson. The parson, it emerges, has a repulsive beard and writes very bad poetry. The companion also writes poetry. The feeling tone of the whole complaint, the bells, the church, the village, the parson's verse, is not about any of these things. It is about poetic rivalry. Every molecule of the walk has drawn the charge of a wound the companion carries elsewhere. The bells rang, and the complex awoke. And for a moment the country walk became something else entirely. This is how a feeling-toned complex works. A situation threatens danger, or merely touches, even indirectly, on an open wound, and the new complex crowds everything else aside. It permits only those ideas to exist that fit its own situation. Under sufficient pressure, it can suppress all opposing ideas toward the point of momentary unconsciousness. The normal ego loses its hold. The affect ego that remains is a weakened thing, greatly inferior in its power to constrain. Once the threat passes, the affect does not end immediately. The knees continue to shake. The heart continues to pound. The fright image returns. first frequently, and then at longer intervals, each time drawing new associations into the mass and sending re-echoing waves of affect through the body. Large complexes are always strongly feeling-toned. Strong effects always leave behind large complexes. This is not a metaphysical claim. It follows directly from the mechanics. A large complex includes numerous somatic innervations, and a strong effect constellates many associations because of its persistent stimulation of the body. In time, most effects subside. The complex sinks. The ideas relating to it disappear from consciousness. Only in dreams do they occasionally reappear in disguised form. But the complex does not vanish. For a long time afterward, there remains what might be called complex sensitiveness, a readiness for the complex to recur at almost full strength in response to stimuli far weaker than the original. A child bitten by a dog will scream at the sight of a dog at a distance. Someone who has received bad news will open every subsequent letter with apprehension. The original event is gone. The charge it left behind is not. Some chronic effects are produced by effects that occurred only once, but struck with sufficient force to reorganize a life. A gallant adventurer named Ramon Lully had long courted a lady. She finally sent a billet inviting him to a midnight meeting. He came to the appointed place. She threw open her robe. He saw that her body was destroyed by disease. The impression lasted the rest of his life. From that evening, Lully devoted himself entirely to pious asceticism. One moment, one feeling-toned complex, a personality reorganized around a single charged event. Other chronic effects are produced by effects that never subside because their source never resolves. The complex remains in continuous excitation. Sexual complexes are the clearest examples because the feeling tone is constantly renewed by unsatisfied desire. The complex must under all circumstances assert itself. When it cannot be acted upon directly, it finds other channels. During youth, it may take the form of abnormal fantasy, alternating with phases of religious enthusiasm. In men, unsatisfied sexuality often converts into feverish professional activity or passion for dangerous sport. Women take up philanthropic work or develop elaborate eccentricities. Others disguise the complex by superimposing a contrasting mood. Among these, the best wits are sometimes found. The finest humorists, whose jokes are spiced with a grain of bitterness that the joke itself will never explain. The displacement can become so stable that it replaces the original character entirely. A man known to everyone as enormously gay and entertaining is, in private, a sullen grumbler nursing an old wound. The assumed blithesomeness holds. Then a single word touches the sore spot. It vanishes at a stroke. A different person stands in its place. The association experiment makes all of this visible in miniature. A stimulus word hits a complex. The reaction time lengthens. The response grows superficial. A rhyme, a sound echo, a verbal motor combination. When distraction increases, superficial associations increase. A reduction of attention inside the experiment therefore indicates an inner distraction. The complex has been touched. It has drawn attention toward itself and away from the task. The subject does not know this is happening. The repressed complex exerts its inhibition from below the threshold of awareness. It prolongs the reaction time, produces failures to react, diminishes the valency of what does emerge. The association experiment does not reveal the complex itself. It reveals the shape of its interference. A woman mourning a recently lost relative reacts to the stimulus word white with the answer black. It seems at first like a common contrast. Analysis shows the path. Snow is white, and so is the sheet covering the face of the dead. An old maid reacts to paint with landscapes. Analysis. One paints landscapes, portraits, faces, also the cheeks when one has wrinkles. The patient, who had recently lost an admirer, was painting her face to appear more attractive. She had once acted in amateur theatricals, at the time when she still had him. The association paint reaches back through 2 decades of longing to arrive at the word landscapes. The complex has an exceptional position compared with ordinary psychic material. Indifferent reactions come without resistance. They can be reproduced unchanged months or years later. Complex associations come only with a struggle. When they are about to appear, they often slip away. Their form is peculiar. The subject does not always know how they arrived. They are liable to amnesia immediately afterward. The complex occupies a relatively independent position with respect to the ego. It is, in the language of the inquiry, a vassal that will not give unqualified allegiance to its rule. If a vassal of this kind gains in strength, the consequences are not contained. The whole of psychic energy applies itself to the complex. Everything not suited to it undergoes a partial, apperceptive degeneration. Even the feeling tone becomes misaligned. Objects of trivial connection to the complex are treated as precious, while vital questions are dismissed with indifference. A man at the height of being in love is, from the outside, indistinguishable from a patient showing blocking, inappropriate laughter, or sudden, complete negativism. The mechanism is the same. The degree is different. The mind is not a neutral instrument through which events pass. It is a field of charged masses, each organized around a feeling tone, each competing for the attention of the ego, each capable of bending the course of thought in its own direction. A complex can behave like a second will. It can act in the dark. It can be carried for years without the subject's knowledge, surfacing only in slips, in dreams, in the whistle of a melody whose words the whistler claims never to have known. The machinery of this is now visible. The question that follows is not whether it operates in ordinary minds. The walk, the bells, the country road make that plain enough. The question is what happens when the complex gains enough intensity that the ego can no longer recover the ground it has ceded. What happens when the vassal stops being a vassal? The inquiry into dementia praecox has always stood at that threshold. The mechanism has now been named. The threshold itself is the next place to stand. Two illnesses stand side by side in the consulting room. One of them has begun to yield its secrets. The other has not. Hysteria, by 1907, is a known country. Its mechanisms have been mapped. Its symptoms move and shift and respond to the analyst's pressure. Dementia praecox is something else entirely. Its face is flat. Its interior is sealed. The known is set against the unknown, not to diminish either. But because the known, placed carefully beside the unknown, can sometimes make the unknown legible. The investigators of dementia praecox, Krepelin, Stransky, and those who followed them, had placed the emotional disturbances near the center of the clinical picture. They described on one side emotional deterioration, on the other the incongruity of ideational content and affect. A patient laughed at what did not warrant laughter. A patient described a catastrophe with the calm composure of a man reading a weather report. The content and the feeling attached to it had come apart. This incongruity had a name in hysteria. The hysterical patient could describe her complaints with a smiling serenity that made an inadequate impression. She spoke of things that ought to touch her deeply with equanimity. The French had given this a phrase: belle indifference, the beautiful indifference, the smile that appears where grief should be. In the consulting room, the reason for this inadequate behavior could always, eventually, be found. So long as the inhibited complex did not become conscious, the patient could speak about it safely. She could even talk it away. Sometimes this talking away deepened into something more complete. She could feel it away, displacing the wound beneath a contrasting mood. One hysterical patient demonstrated this over a long period. Whenever gloomy thoughts pressed on her, she worked herself into a mood of boisterous merriment, repressing the complex beneath the noise of her own performance. When she related something sad, something that ought to have moved her deeply, she accompanied it with loud laughter. At other times, she spoke with an absolute indifference, a deliberateness that itself betrayed her, as if her complexes were not the remotest concern to anyone, including herself. The reason for this incongruity is the autonomy of the complex. The complex allows itself to be reproduced only when it wishes. It does not surrender on demand. The belle indifference does not last. It is interrupted. A wild outburst of affect arrives without announcement. A fit of crying, a gesture of violence that has nothing in common with the former composure. The mask drops. Behind it is something adequate and stormy. The same interruption was observed at Burghölzli in joint examinations conducted by Bleuler and his colleague. The apathetic or euphoric mask held until analysis succeeded in laying bare the complex. At that moment, the mask fell away. An adequate affect replaced it, often quite a stormy one, exactly as in hysteria when the sore spot is touched. The mechanism was the same. In some cases, however, the blocking could not be penetrated. The patient continued to give non-committal answers. The more direct the question bore on the complex, the less they answered. The sore spot resisted every approach. The latency of feeling, the delay between stimulus and affect, appeared in both diseases. Hysterical patients could speak with apparent indifference and superficiality about critical points. Hours later, the ward was in disturbance. The conversation had subsequently produced an affect. The stimulus had acted after a period of incubation. Janet had observed this in his own patients. They remained calm at the moment of an event that ought genuinely to have excited them. Only after a latency period of hours, or even days, did the corresponding affect appear. Bates recorded the same mechanism in himself during an earthquake. He called it emotional paralysis, the feeling that should have arrived at the moment of catastrophe arrived later, when the body had already passed through the event in a state of apparent stillness. The affective states without adequate ideational content, the anxiety that attaches itself to an object that does not deserve anxiety, had their analogies in hysteria as well. A patient suffered from the obsession that she had infected the clergyman and doctor with her obsessional ideas. She proved to herself over and over that this was unfounded and senseless. The anxiety did not diminish. The ideational content was transparently inadequate. The source of the affect lay elsewhere. Depressions in hysteria followed the same concealment. A young woman wept at every answer, for no apparent reason. She traced it, with great persistence, to pains in her arm that she sometimes felt while working. The actual source was a love affair with a man who would not marry her. The arm was a screen. The screen was more bearable than the thing it covered. Freud named this mechanism displacement. The effect did not belong to the object it appeared to inhabit. It belonged to a repressed complex, which used the visible object as a disguise. The explosive excitements in dementia precox followed the same logic. The sudden outburst of affect in hysteria always concealed a clear cause when analysis reached it. A thoughtless remark, a disturbing letter, the anniversary of a crucial event. A trifle was sufficient. Sometimes only a symbol was needed to release the complex. The same principle applied to dementia precox. The psychological clue existed. In many cases, it could be found. The disease was too obscure to permit this in every instance. But the absence of a visible cause was not the same as the absence of any cause. The lack of self-control in dementia precox, the unruliness of affect, appeared wherever emotivity was pathologically intensified. In hysteria, in epilepsy, in the sharper clinical territory of the psychoses, the symptom pointed in every case to a disturbance of ego synthesis. There were autonomous complexes strong enough that they no longer fitted inside the hierarchy of the ego complex, They acted outside it. Here, the likeness between the two diseases began to show its limit. In hysteria, emotional rapport could be achieved and sustained. The complex varied in intensity. The analyst could reach it, and the reaching produced something. In dementia, precox, the complex was stable. Emotional rapport was possible only for moments. Brief windows when the analyst touched the complex directly. Immediately after, the personality confronted the analyst as coldly and strangely as before. Analysis could sometimes cause a flaring of symptoms. In hysteria, improvement usually followed penetration. In dementia, precox, nothing changed. The patient stuck to the delusional assertions. Hostile motives were attributed to the analyst. The complex held, and the holding was total. This difference between the two diseases was not a difference in mechanism. The mechanism was the same. The complex was autonomous in both. The repression was active in both. The delayed effect, the screen cause, the explosive excitement released by a trifle. These operated identically across the boundary. The difference was in degree and in something further that the psychology alone could not specify. In dementia, precox, the mechanisms ran a more rapid and thorough course. The complex did not merely inhibit, it annihilated the ground around it. What the comparison established was this: the flat affect of the patient in the acute ward was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling under extreme inhibition. The wound existed. The complex was real. The adequate affect was present and would erupt when analysis touched the right point, if analysis could reach it at all. The indifference was a guard, not a vacancy. The method that had opened hysteria was the same method that could, in principle, be carried across the bridge into the territory of the psychosis. The psychological instruments belonged in the asylum. Whether they would find purchase there, whether the walls of dementia precox would yield as the walls of hysteria had yielded, that was not yet established. But the bridge had been identified. It had been measured. The mask of indifference had been lifted far enough to confirm that something lay beneath it, and what lay beneath it was recognizable. It was the same charged, autonomous, wound-carrying structure that the study of hysteria had already taught the inquiry to read. B. Saint is a dressmaker. She was born in 1845. She is unmarried. In 1887, she was admitted to Burghölzli, and she has not left since. The clinical record that follows her across the decades is a single life made visible. One mind, one corridor, one set of hands that still sews with care, while the mouth whispers its private language to no one in particular. On the day of her admission, she had already been hearing voices for several years. The voices slandered her. She knew what they were. She called them invisible telephones. The letters she wrote to the superintendent in the summer of 1887 are lucid in grammar and broken in sense. On the 5th of July, she wrote that her head was clearer than ever, and and that she could not be made to understand why she had not been discharged. She described suffering from novelties of all descriptions. She expected her end. On the 16th of August, she wrote again. The suffering continued. She needed an immediate discharge. The horrors ceased, she said, when she was away from Zurich. She asked to be believed. The letters were filed. By 1888, her speech had grown more incoherent. A large but incomprehensible role was now played by a figure she called Rubinstein from Petersburg. He was sending her money by the wagon load. There was a monopoly. She made curious gestures with her hands. In 1889, she reported that her spinal marrow was being torn out in the night. Pains in the back were caused by substances passing through the walls, covered with magnetism. Extracts were made by an inhalation of chemistry. The clinical record continued its entries year by year. In 1890, the word banknote monopoly became her central term. By 1892, she had become the Queen of the Orphans and the proprietress of Burghölzli Asylum. Naples and she must supply the whole world with macaroni. By 1894, her requests for discharge arrived at every visit, delivered in a totally unemotional tone. By 1895, she owned a banknote factory, 7 stories high, with coal raven black windows. In 1896, she was Germania and Helvetia of exclusively sweet butter. She was Noah's Ark. She was the boat of salvation and respect. She was Mary Stuart. She was Empress Alexander. The ordinary worker who sat beside her in the sewing room heard none of this. What she heard was the patient's breath. B. Saint whispered while she worked. She whispered her power words, stereotyped sentences or fragments of sentences, whose content was strange, whose delivery was calm, and whose purpose was entirely her own. The physician who took word associations from B. Saint over a period of 2 years found that nearly every stimulus word pulled toward the same gravitational center. The word pupil produced Socrates. The word head produced the phrase yes, irreplaceable. The word mountain produced valleys, but the mountain also appeared in her stereotypy. I created the highest mountain peak, the Finsteraarhorn. The word asylum produced causation. She explained this one. Private people cause such asylums. As owner of the world, she had established this asylum, not caused it. The distinction mattered to her. The word ring produced bond, alliance, or betrothal. The reaction time was long. The word flower produced camellia. Camellias were something she wanted. The word dream produced reality. Her delusional ideas were taken from dreams, and when they were challenged, she insisted on the reality of every object of her wishes. The associations did not come and go like the reactions of an ordinary mind touching an indifferent world. They were one-sided. They were concentrated. The word cat produced slander with a reaction time of 21 seconds. She explained. She had once been slandered because she carried cats in her arms. The word splendid produced annoyance. She explained. People called things splendid when those things were unpleasant. Her fortune had been withheld from her so splendidly for so long. The word world produced world owner in 4 seconds. The word sweet produced I have to experience the bitterness of life. The impression created by this accumulation was clinical. It suggested a lack of affect, a mind reporting its contents without feeling. But something contradicted that impression. The signs of strong feeling tone appeared everywhere in the record. Reaction times lengthened. Associations came hesitatingly, with preambles, with the small prefatory sounds of someone approaching something that caused difficulty. The affect had not disappeared. Its expression had. What remained in its place were the husks. Worn-out forms, repeated phrases, the shape of an emotion emptied of its heat, but still organizing everything around it. The analyst turned from the word associations to the neologisms. Be Saint had dozens of them. They were her technical terms. When she whispered during her sewing, she was whispering these. Double polytechnic, professorship, Schnecken Museum clothing, Silver Island, Zeringer, the interest drafts. Direct questioning produced only more neologisms in return. A different approach was needed. For each power word, the analyst let her associate freely, following the thread wherever it led. The thread of Socrates led back to a dressmaker. She was the best dressmaker. She never cut a thread. She never left a bit of cloth on the floor. She was an artist, a professor in her line. She was wise. She was modest. She had achieved the highest. She was slandered and not recognized and considered ill. All of these things, she felt, were analogies of the life of Socrates. She therefore said, I am Socrates. She meant it as a metaphor. The disease had collapsed the distance between the metaphor and the fact. She could no longer get away from the identification. She took it at its face value. She expected everyone to understand it. The thread of double polytechnic led to the same place. Only the arts were more fully enumerated. There was dressmaking and culinary art. There was the plum tart with cornmeal crust. The Polytechnic in Zurich was a stately building and therefore belonged to her. The word double appeared to carry a meaning not yet visible. The thread of owner of the world produced a list. Grand Hotel, hotel life, omnibuses, theatres, carriages, trams, houses, stations, steamships, railways, post, telegraph, national holidays, music, stores, libraries, governments, gondolas, delegates, payments, coaches, a Negro on the box, flag, bags, villa, servants and maids, carpets, curtains, mirrors. The list was precise and affectionate. Each item had been considered. The detail of the Negro on the box was carefully observed. These images were the prerequisites of a princely existence. Behind the incomprehensible surface of the delusion, a specific hunger had been doing its work for decades, furnishing the mind's interior with everything it had been denied. The thread of interest drafts produced food and fabrics, cocoa, chocolate, noodles, coffee, sugar candy, honey cakes, velvet, merino, alpaca, shoes, boots, stockings, petticoats, hats, gloves. These were the concrete wishes of everyday life. They had been compiled with care. 3 complexes organized the whole structure. The first was wish fulfillment. The second was the complex of injury. The third was the sexual complex. The sexual complex had been the most deeply buried. It surfaced in the analysis of Amphi, an animal of longish shape that crawled, that was associated with gentlemen, and that appeared most distinctly in a dream in which a small green snake approached her mouth as if to kiss her. At the word snake, the patient blushed. She gave a bashful laugh. The effect was fresh, immediate, unmistakable. It was the same effect that had been absent everywhere else. The complex of injury spoke through her stereotypes of persecution, paralysis, and suffering. She was tormented. She was burdened. There were tons of iron plate on her back. Poisons were shot through her window. The invisible telephone made remarks. It called out corrections she did not want to hear. Once, while she was explaining what a misfortune it would be for the world if she should die before the payment arrived, the telephone broke in. It would do no harm, the telephone said. They would simply take another owner. The analyst recognized the voice. It was a split-off fragment of normal criticism. The complex of grandeur had absorbed conscious life so completely that the correcting function had been driven underground. From underground it returned as a hallucination, ironic, lucid, slightly contemptuous, mocking the assertions it could no longer prevent. B. Saint had grown up in poverty. Her family was of low standing. Her sister had taken a different path entirely. She herself had worked with her hands and kept a respectable and quiet life, and arrived at the age that brings an accounting. What the accounting found was a life without the fortune, the titles, the husband, the children, the recognition, the home that a full life might have held. The disease had not invented new desires. It had taken the existing ones and removed the correction that kept them scaled to what was possible. Every title answered a specific lack. Empress Alexander answered the woman who had never been given a name that mattered. Owner of the world, answered the woman who had owned nothing. Queen of the orphans, answered the woman who was, in the deepest sense, one. The banknote monopoly answered decades of financial insecurity. The children who emerged from her mouth in dreams. The boy doll, resembling the admired doctor. The little girl in the brown frock who was slightly paralyzed like her mother, answered the children who had never come. The delusion was a coded autobiography. Every fragment of nonsense concealed a readable sentence. The work of analysis had not imposed a meaning on an empty structure. It had recovered a meaning that was already there, already organizing every association, every reaction time, every whispered power word in the sewing room. The mind of B. Saint had not disintegrated into random noise. It had continued, in its own register, to speak. It had been speaking for decades to a science that had not yet learned to listen. That, finally, was what the single record confirmed. The central wager of the inquiry. That the content of madness was not debris, but text, had been tested against one life and one mind, followed across 30 years of clinical notes and 2 years of association experiments. The wager held. The locked interior of a mind judged senseless had been entered. What was found inside was not chaos. It was loss and longing, and the long labor of a psyche doing what psyches do, building from whatever materials remain something that answers the shape of what is missing. The statue of Pinel stands at the gateway of the Salpêtrière in Paris. Stone, fixed. The chains he removed from the insane are not there. They were removed in the 1790s, carried away, and not replaced. That act, a physician ordering the restraints undone, marked the moment when the criminal and the mad were formally separated. The insane were no longer criminals. They were patients. What followed from that distinction took a century to reach its full force. And by the time it did, it had hardened into a dogma printed in every textbook of psychiatry in Europe. Mental diseases are diseases of the brain. The sentence arrived by accumulation. Pinel freed the patients from the stigma. Then Esquirol and Boll, working in France at roughly the same time, made a discovery. Certain forms of insanity ended in death after a short course. And when the skull was opened afterward, regular changes in the brain could be demonstrated. They had found general paralysis of the insane, softening of the brain, as the public called it, and the cerebral tissue showed chronic inflammatory shrinkage. Here was a mental disease explained by a visible wound. The dogma had its first foundation stone. Gall placed another. He traced the partial loss of speech, a psychic faculty, to a lesion in the lower left frontal convolution. The psyche had been assigned its first address in the cortex, Wernicke, working toward the end of the 19th century, localized the speech center in the left temporal hopes climbed. The implication was that time would assign every psychic faculty its place in the grey matter. Every characteristic, every mental event would eventually map onto a discrete region of the brain. Meinert in Vienna proposed a complete system in which alterations of the blood supply to specific areas of the cortex drove the origin of the psychoses. Wernicke built his own anatomical explanation, more ingenious still. The result was visible in every asylum in Europe. Even the smallest and most remote institution acquired its anatomical laboratory. Cerebral sections were cut, stained, mounted, and examined under the microscope. The journals filled with morphological contributions, the paths of fibers in the brain and spinal cord, the structure and distribution of cells in the cerebral cortex, and the various ways those cells were destroyed in different diseases. These became the primary language of psychiatric science, and so psychiatry arrived at a condition its critics named with precision. It had put the organ above the function. The psyche became an appendage of the brain. A function had been mistaken for the instrument that carried it. The comparison that formed in 1908 was exact. Psychiatry was behaving like a man who believed he could decipher the meaning and purpose of a building by a mineralogical analysis of its stones. At Burghölzli, a count was kept. In 4 years, 1,325 mental patients were admitted to the hospital, approximately 331 per year. Of those, 9% suffered from constitutional psychic anomalies, inborn defects of the psyche. Of that 9%, roughly a quarter showed definite cerebral changes: congenital microcephalus, pronounced hydrocephalus, malformation of parts of the brain. The remaining 3/4 showed no trace of typical findings in the brain. 3% suffered from epileptic mental disturbances. Typical brain degeneration was demonstrable only in severe cases of long duration. In shorter cases, nothing could be found. 17% suffered from progressive paralysis and senile deterioration. Both showed characteristic cerebral findings. 14% had been admitted for poisoning, chiefly alcohol. In milder cases, nothing could be found in the brain. The severe cases with demonstrable cortical shrinkage amounted to less than 1% of annual alcoholism admissions. 6% suffered from manic depressive insanity. In this disease, no morphological lesions of the brain could be demonstrated. 45% suffered from dementia praecox. The name was imprecise. The dementia was not always precocious, and not every case ended in permanent deterioration. But the disease was common, often incurable, and its brain, when examined post-mortem, was as a rule intact. In cases of the most severe and prolonged type, an unimpaired brain was not infrequently found on the table. Only in a few cases were slight changes discovered, and even those could not yet be proved regular. The summary was stark. In round figures, approximately 1/4 of patients showed more or less extensive lesions of the brain. 3/4 had a brain that appeared unimpaired or showed changes changes that offered no explanation of the psychological disturbance. The chronic population of the asylum, those who did not die quickly, those who formed its permanent community, consisted of up to 70 or 80% cases of dementia precox. Their brains showed almost nothing. The anatomical approach, applied to the disease most requiring explanation, returned silence. The way forward was clearly marked. It could only go through psychology. The Zurich clinic abandoned the anatomical approach and turned to psychological investigation. The prior histories of patients were traced wherever possible. The efforts were rewarded. The illness broke out. Again and again. At a moment of great emotion. The emotion had arisen from comprehensible circumstances, and the symptoms that followed, previously opaque, previously attributed to random cellular malfunction, became intelligible the moment the patient's history was known. A cook, aged 32, had been engaged and had concealed from her fiancé an illegitimate child born years before. She decorated her hat with red and green feathers. She bought pince-nez to wear on their walks together. She had all her teeth extracted unnecessarily. The night afterward, she became convinced that the extraction had been a great sin, an unpardonable sin, and she could not be reasoned out of it. What the anatomically minded physician saw was bizarre delusion, inappropriate emotional emphasis, and cellular disorder. What the psychological approach found was a woman attempting to raise her value in the eyes of a man she feared would leave her. And then, after the surgery, left her briefly unguarded, shifting her real guilt onto a smaller and more bearable object. She could not confess the larger sin. She wept instead over the extraction of teeth. This was not senseless product of disordered brain cells. It was a recognizable human strategy driven to extremity. A foreign archaeologist, small, physically weak, afflicted with a stammer, had loved a woman in his student years and never spoken to her. She had married someone else. He buried himself in his work. Years later, passing through the town associated with her memory, he was overtaken by a first episode of violent frenzy. Then, after recovery and years of hermit-like work, he returned to the same town. A second episode began. Milder, but shaped by the same material. He performed feats of gymnastics, declared himself a great singer, an orator and poet. His voice suddenly magnificent, his body powerful and beautiful. His actual voice was squeaky, his stammer unresolved, his build unimpressive. Each delusion answered a precise lack. The excesses of the second episode corresponded exactly to the deficiencies of his life. This was not random. It was a response. Even such methods, however, encountered a limit. Freud, using an improved analytical technique in 1911, subjected the famous autobiography of D.P. Schreiber, a paranoid case of dementia. To the same reductive analysis, he showed how the delusional system had been built from infantile drives and early relationships. The analysis was ingenious. It revealed the universally human foundations from which the delusion had grown. Yet something remained. The reductive method suited hysteria better than dementia precox. In hysteria, tracing the source of a symptom back to its infantile root dissolved the symptom. In psychosis, the same tracing left the symbolic structure standing, vast and overpowering, unexplained in its forward direction. The difference could be illustrated by way of Goethe's Faust. A commentator could trace every element of Part 2 to its historical sources. He could map Part 1 onto the conflicts in the poet's own soul and show how those conflicts arose from universal human tensions familiar to every reader. The analysis would be accurate. It would explain how the work came to be. And at the end of it, a reader would still be holding a closed question. The question of what Faust means, what it is reaching toward, what it does to the person who experiences it, why it was made, would remain untouched. To understand how a thing was produced is not yet to understand what it intends. 2 acts of understanding were named. The first was retrospective, causal, analytical, reductive. It moved backward from the present phenomenon to its generating conditions. It was the method of science as the century had defined science. The second was prospective, constructive, synthetic. It moved forward from the present phenomenon towards what the phenomenon was attempting to become. A causal understanding of the psyche captured only one half of it. The psyche was also something in the process of becoming. To read only its past was to read only half a text. The Gothic cathedral was more than a sum of its stones. A mineralogical analysis of those stones, limestone, sandite, iron staining, the precise crystalline structure of each block, would be accurate and would explain nothing. The cathedral was not a message written in calcium. It was a structure designed to do something to the human being who stood inside it. And that intention could not be located in any individual stone. The meaning was in the relation, in the form, in the goal the builders were pursuing. The 45% of Burghölzli patients whose disease returned no findings in any anatomical laboratory had not been explained by stones. 3/4 of every patient admitted in 4 years had not been explained by stones. The brain had been measured, sectioned, stained, and catalogued. What the psyche was doing, and why, and where it was going. These questions had not been asked by the instruments in the anatomical laboratory. The inquiry had been asking the wrong question. It had asked how the disorder was produced. The question that remained standing, unanswered, was what the disorder meant. And that question pointed in a direction the laboratory instruments could not face. Inward, forward, toward the living and continuing activity of a mind that was not a machine, but an agent, something that was not merely the residue of its causes, but something that was, however derangedly, still reaching toward a future. Below the threshold of consciousness, there is a region without light and without edges. Its contents cannot be observed directly. They can only be inferred. The sum of all psychic events that never cross into awareness. That is the working definition, not a metaphor, a functional territory, as real as the cortex. Leibniz had already named its elements: perceptions insensibles, vague perceptions too faint to register as thought, but accumulating until they cross into awareness. Kant called them shadowy representations. The philosophers who followed placed the unconscious beneath consciousness as its foundation. It was not where the mind discarded its refuse. It was where the mind did most of its work. The method for discovering what lies there is the method of elimination. A complete inventory of the conscious mind leaves, by subtraction, the contents of the unconscious. The inventory begins with an ordinary man. He is a merchant, happily married, thorough in business, self-respecting, enlightened, a member of a liberal discussion society. He believes these things because they are true, as far as they go. What he does not know is that he allows letters to go unanswered, forgets his wife's errands, underdeclares his income, and votes for the socialists when taxes rise. He undertook a large transaction and noticed, only when recording it, that the date was Friday the 13th. He was disturbed. The man who considers himself a freethinker is also superstitious. The conscious mind has no room for the careless, untrustworthy man who also inhabits the same body. That man is the common heritage of mankind. He lives in the unconscious because the conscious image has left no place for him. This submerged life compensates. Every extreme tendency in consciousness is softened by a counter-impulse from below. Nebuchadnezzar, at the height of his power, dreamed of a tree that must fall. The dream rose from the compensating depths. When the balance fails, compensating contents break through in forms the conscious mind cannot use. The isolated man hears voices that accuse him. The ambitious engineer, unable to absorb self-criticism, finds instead that strangers conspire against him. The alcoholic who has lost his love for his wife becomes jealous of her. The love has not vanished. It has become subliminal, and from below it returns only as its own distortion. These are not random failures of the brain. Each follows a strict psychological sequence. Behind every negative reaction, there is a complex. The complex is the cause of the resistance, and the complex has a history. The dogma standing against this conclusion is deeply embedded. Mental diseases are diseases of the brain. The sentence was printed into every textbook when general paralysis was discovered and the cortex was first mapped. The medical student received the axiom. He received no alternative. He carried it into every diagnosis he ever made. Scientific materialism held in medicine because the anatomical laboratory produced results, even if those results explained only a fraction of the patients in the wards. General paralysis followed its own schedule, regardless of a patient's environment. Dementia praecox did not. The worst catatonic states were products of the asylum itself. Overcrowded wards, coercive measures, forced inactivity, all made the disease worse. Remove them, and the disease improved. An organic process does not respond to a vase of flowers by the window. A psychological process does. The cases confirmed it. A man seized by catatonic excitement each time he returned to the town where an unhappy love affair had ended. A woman who announced that if she were treated as mad, she would show what madness meant, and demonstrated it immediately, completely, for 2 months. The psychological history explained everything the organic hypothesis could not touch. A woman of about 50 was examined by 2 specialists who diagnosed sarcoma of the membranes of the spinal cord. The physical examination was careful. A piece of her skin was excised and examined histologically. What was entirely overlooked was that she was a human being with a psychology. She was a widow whose eldest son had replaced her husband as the center of her life. The son left. The first fit of crying occurred that same day. Every improvement and exacerbation corresponded exactly to changes in the relationship with him. There was no sarcoma. Both specialists assured the consulting physician that there was nothing psychic in the case. They had noted every physical circumstance and recorded none of the psychological ones. The reversal that follows is not comfortable. On the basis of an unknown psychological disposition, an unadapted psychological function may arise first. The cellular changes occasionally found in schizophrenic brains may be secondary to that function. Consequences rather than causes, as the wasting of unused muscles is secondary to a hysterical paralysis with no organic root. Psyche as cause, not as consequence. The unconscious is not a figure of speech. Its contents are real. They act, they compensate, distort, and project. And when driven past what the conscious personality can absorb, they displace reality entirely. A disease that begins there is a psychological disease in the full and consequential sense, not merely colored by biography, but generated in and by the psyche itself. The brain has been dethroned, not abolished. Its role in some diseases is beyond dispute, but it can no longer hold the throne alone. The submerged half of the mind has surfaced. The same corridor, the same wards at the end of the same long hallway. Burghölzli has not changed its walls. What has changed is the man who walks through them. 50 years older, the argument he began here still running in every textbook, exactly as it ran at the start. Mental diseases are diseases of the brain. The specific destruction of brain cells has never been proved in schizophrenia. The assumption survives regardless. Bleuler had identified a primary symptom, not the delusions, not the voices. Those were secondary, their content shaped by emotional complexes. their specific form determined by psychological causes. The primary symptom was something more fundamental, a mutilation of the association process. Connections between ideas were severed. Trains of thought fell apart. The description matched, in everything essential, what Pierre Janet had named earlier, the abaissement du niveau mental, a slackening of the will. When that guiding force relaxes, a train of thought cannot be carried through to its conclusion. Strange contents interrupted. The mind descends from directed thinking toward the logic of dreams. The abaissement operates in neurosis too. In hysteria, the dissociation can deepen until secondary personalities form. But the unity of the personality is potentially preserved. A guiding intelligence remains. In schizophrenia, the connection between the ego and its complexes is not weakened. It is cut. The split is absolute. The mirror has not cracked. It has shattered into splinters, and the fracture is very often permanent. In neurosis, the ego still fights. The conflict is painful, but the conflict constitutes a connection, a form of dialogue, which is still a form of relationship. In schizophrenia, the patient is not overcome by violent emotion. He is drowned in a flood of forces and thought forms that go far beyond any ordinary emotion. And what floods in is not personal. That is the discovery that decades of clinical practice forced into clarity. A young woman of 19, admitted at 17 with catatonia and hallucinations, was unreachable for weeks. Hands cold and bluish, livid patches across her face, pupils dilated and barely responsive. After daily sessions of patient, slow questioning, she began to whisper. The moment speech returned, something physical changed. The pupils contracted, her hands grew warm. She had grown up in a small town with no knowledge of mythology or folklore. What she described was a detailed account of her life on the moon, where she had fulfilled the role of a female savior for the people who lived there. The classical association between the moon and lunacy was entirely unknown to her. The mythological motifs she used had no traceable source in her biography. After more than a year of treatment, she was discharged, married, had children, and remained free of pathological attacks for 30 years. Psychotic contents in paranoid schizophrenia showed peculiarities that personal history could not explain. A neurosis could always, with sufficient care, be traced to biographical material. Psychotic contents resisted this reduction. They resembled what certain primitive traditions called the big dream. Numinous, highly impressive, its imagery matching motifs found in Greek myth, Egyptian myth, ancient Mexican myth, and in the folklore of cultures that had never touched each other. Patients ignorant of all these traditions produced the same forms. The term chosen for these structures was archetype, not an inherited idea. An inherited condition for forming ideas. As an instinct is not a specific behavior, but the disposition toward a class of behaviors. Archetypes appeared everywhere and at all times. Beneath the personal unconscious, organized around individual experience, lay something older, a collective layer shared across the species, indifferent to biography. The resemblance between schizophrenic states and those induced by mescaline pressed for explanation. Perceptual variance normally excluded by consciousness became perceptible under mescaline. The normal synthesis of ideas broke apart. The picture was not identical. Mescaline produced a fluid continuity where schizophrenic apperception was abrupt and halting. But the resemblance revived the early guess. An emotion exceeding the capacity of the brain cells might produce a specific metabolic disturbance. The chemical and the psychic stood side by side, neither cancelling the other. The disease had two faces. A young student suffered a devastating disappointment in love and had a catatonic attack. He recovered, completed his studies, and became a successful professional. Years later, he returned to Zurich, where the love affair had happened. Another attack, almost immediately. He avoided the city for years, then returned. Within days, he was back in the clinic. An organic disease of fixed cellular origin does not wait for a patient to return to a particular street. Treatment by psychological means was real and bounded. An educated woman attending lectures on a tantric text grew more and more fascinated by the contents of the unconscious until her dreams arrived in a different register. Earthquakes, collapsing houses, floods. These isolation symptoms, images of ground giving way, were the sign of an invasion already underway. She was forbidden to continue the lectures and sent instead to Schopenhauer, whose emphasis on the redeeming power of consciousness could hold the line the tantric material had begun to dissolve. The symptomatic dream stopped. It emerged that 25 years earlier, she had experienced a brief schizophrenic episode. A patient at the edge of relapse could be asked to paint the chaos he inhabited. The apparently unmanageable disorder of his total situation became visible, objectified, held at the distance a conscious eye requires. The overwhelming was made into a picture, and a picture could be looked at. Brother Klaus had turned a terrifying vision of God into the image of the Trinity now hanging in the parish church at Saxon, transformed the unbearable into the contemplatable by the same act of deliberate making. The 50-year argument ended not in a verdict but in a formulation. The disease was not organic or psychological. It was both. The secondary symptoms were organized by emotional complexes as surely as in any neurosis. The deepest stratum of what the psychosis mobilized was ancient and collective, older than any single life, older than any biographical wound. The locked door of 1907 had not been opened. It stood ajar. research was still only at its beginning. The results were merely encouraging. The script was based on the book The Psychology of Dementia Praecox, authored by C.G. Jung and first published in 1907. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey begins,